a round table, and that is a slightly different format. It allows each of our participants to talk for around, but no more than 10 minutes, because we want to move quite fast. And the thing is that really what we want to look at is we're now looking forward. We're now looking forward to think what are the key themes that may be really critical as we move forward, looking at safety and security and cities, but really are issues that may not have been as addressed through the course of the program so far. And the four issues that we're talking about are climate change, migration, municipal governance, and the private sector. So we've got four issues, but what we're going to start with this end, climate change, and Masonda Mumba, pardon me, yeah? Okay, who's the program coordinator for UNEP's ecosystem-based adaptation program within the climate change adaptation scheme. So she provides technical assistance to governments globally on a range of really critical issues. One of the things I like about this panel is we are equally Masomenas gendered, but we also have people from all the continents. And Masunda comes from Zambia. She has a BSc from the university there and a PhD from UCL in London, and she has enormous experience on wetland research. So I'm going to pass it over to her and give her the first 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you so much for having me here, and welcome to the panelists as well. I think I just want to begin by saying that I'm kind of wearing two hats here, actually, because I also sit as a science and policy advisor for the CARIA, which is the Collaborative Adaptation Research in Africa and Asia, which is actually funded by IDRC and DFID. And also, I'm working on ecosystem-based adaptation, which is how we basically, as humanity, we depend on ecosystems and how they're changing, how they're cushioning us from the stresses of climate change, and how they also help us in adapting to these shifts. So I really want to talk from that context and that perspective as an emerging issue, and also just give some examples of my personal experiences in places I've lived and also places I've worked in. So I want to start by saying that when I moved into Kenya in 2006 from London, I was working then with WWF, and I moved here, and just as I joined UNEP a couple of years later after that, I put together, actually over a glass of wine really, with a few girlfriends, and we were chatting and really interrogating spaces. All of us had been in the diaspora doing amazing work, etc., and had returned. And as we were talking, we came up with an idea. And it just so happened that my girlfriends and a few other friends, one was working for the Institute of Security Studies. The other two were working for OCHA, which is the Office of Humanitarian Coordination of the UN. And I was working for UN Environment. And so we coined this phrase, security in mobility, and came up with this rather small project, actually, which ended up becoming fairly bigger. What was it all about? I think the conversation, 2006, for those who remember, 2006, 2007, was quite interesting that, there was obviously political violence, but not only was there political violence in Kenya, there was also a drought, a pretty severe drought. And what we saw, for the first time having moved back to the continent, I saw cows in the middle of Nairobi. I was like, what's going on? And my friends were like, well, the cows do come, the Maasai, this is part of their territory, etc. Anyhow, we began to interrogate this space from that perspective. But what was more interesting for me was that when I spoke to a member of parliament to say, look, people migrate because there's a disaster, there's no water, and there's just nothing to feed themselves and their animals, and they will move because of a climate signal, a climate factor, and slow onset. This particular member of parliament looked at me, and she happened to be a woman. She looked at me and she says, Musonda, can I just tell you something? When we sit in the parliament here in Kenya, or even at the EAC level, when you mention the word pastoralism, we're talking small arms, we're talking violence, they're going across the border. So I'm not going to be discussing this from a perspective of climate change. And that was really interesting. And I thought, okay, how is she actually looking at it from a perspective of violence, i.e. small arms, and also not looking at the trigger And of course, migration is very complex. It is complex. But for me, I'm interested really in understanding how when people move from rural settings into urban settings and the dynamics change, mainly because an ecosystem has changed. When you have drought, there's no grass, there's no water, there's nothing. So I really wanted to interrogate it from that perspective. But I also want to add and say that I think we need to really be honest with ourselves that urban resilience is something that is really something we have to be discussing and also should be really high on the agenda because the majority of the populations in the world are living in cities. A few weeks ago, I was at the Carrier Annual Learning Meeting, which IDRC and DFID had organized in Kathmandu. And it was really fascinating because we took a field trip into the middle of Kathmandu. And for those of you who've been to Nepal, I mean, anywhere else in Asia for that matter, I mean, these are ancient, exciting, and phenomenal civilizations. Smack in the middle of this populous city is a water system that spans back 2,300 years ago. And this water system basically has water ponds, then they cascade into the underground system, and then connect to the next pond. Now, with urbanization, mind you, and the irony of it, I wish I had a picture to share, but the irony of it was the Ministry of Water had built its building on top of one of the ponds. So now that concrete, the hot concrete that was poured there, is not providing seepage. Now, with droughts and changes in the monsoon climate and all of that, there is hardly any recharge in the systems, and so there's very little water cascading through and providing for the rural poor in particular. So what we're beginning to see in some of the work that I've been involved in is that actually, and I listened in on the previous panel, the conversation, I think data exists. It's fragmented, it's scattered, it's in different places, but everybody has to come together. Perhaps that's what also the Sustainable Development Goals will do. We have to have a collective conversation. I just want to also say that I think climate change as a compounding factor is also going to change how people behave. You know, one moment you have a job, the next moment your entire field is flooded. You cannot harvest, you cannot do anything. You have to think very quickly if you've got 5 children that you have to educate and send to school and feed yourselves. So there are all these complexities that we have to contend with and deal with. How do we deal with those complexities? And I think that's a conversation that we really need to bring to the table and how collective that conversation is happening. Lastly, I just want to say that I think the issue of preparedness, especially at the city level, in a lot of sort of circumstances, there's an expectation and also assumption that people in cities are more prepared than in rural settings. Actually, urban poverty is really the worst. And urban violence, because you don't have the support system. In a village, you can move to someone else's farm or communicate with a relative to help you out or even give you your next meal, not in a city setting. And we're going to see these extreme events manifest in very strange ways. I mean, and we're not immune, whether we're coming from developed or developing country. Point in case, Paris. Paris 2015 had a heat wave. And over 3,000 people died. And, you know, they even have systems that can support that mechanism. Let's talk about Nairobi. Let's talk about Lagos. Let's talk about Johannesburg. Let's talk about other cities in the world that really are going to change substantively, and coastal cities in particular, and how those implications will happen globally. So in closing, I just want to say that I think in dealing with the topic at hand, in looking at safe cities and violence, we have to be aware that with the emerging issue of climate change, people's livelihoods will change. People's dynamics will change substantively. And also with extreme weather events, we're going to see job losses and perhaps even job gains, we don't know. So there are all these opportunistic and non-opportunistic circumstances that we need to be aware of and also take into account, and I don't want to touch on the issue of migration because there's someone on the panel that's going to talk about that, but I think for me it's also a very critical issue that we have to contend with, because migration is happening more in country than it's even happening across the borders as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think we're starting with a very interesting perspective, which shows us how clearly these issues are interrelated. And I appreciate not going too far into migration, but it's not that it's this connectivity that you've raised, which I think is fantastic. So I'm now going to pass on to Dr. Eduardo Moncada, who is from the US. So we have, I told you we were going to have people from everywhere. And he's assistant professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. And interesting, his research focuses on the political origins of crime and violence in the developing world. But his particular focus, and that's what he's going to talk about now, is on the business sector. We had somebody representing business already in this meeting, and I think it's wonderful that we're coming back to it. And his particular emphasis is on the ways that business firms resist protection rackets in parts of Latin America. So I guess you are from Latin America rather than from the US. I apologize. But, we have to have the US represented, don't we?
I'll fulfill that role this time around, sure. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes? All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I did want to say first that for me, as someone not involved in the Psych project, this has been a real privilege to kind of be able to learn from all of you, from the exciting and important work that you're carrying out. So thank you very much for that. And I just want to offer sort of a few broad thoughts for discussion and debate. But before I do that, let me just tell you a little bit about my research as a way of kind of contextualizing how I arrived at these thoughts. So as Caroline mentioned, my research focuses on the political economy of criminal violence, mainly in Latin American cities. So what do I mean by political economy of criminal violence? Well, I study the relationship between the urban private sector, local politicians, and criminal organizations. So one of the places where I've conducted research is Medellin, which is a city that has been mentioned a few times during the conference, including during the last panel. I'm not sure if anyone's here from that panel right now. Medellin went from extremely high levels of lethal violence in the 80s and 90s to dramatically low levels of violence in the 2000s. And out of that decline in violence emerged something very interesting, something that gets referred to as this Medellin model of urbanism, right? The notion that what led to a sort of sustained reduction in violence was a committed local government that worked hand in hand with the private sector to address inequality, social exclusion, and class conflict. So the official story of Medellin kind of embodies one version of the public-private partnership model that was discussed briefly during the last panel yesterday, for those of you who were here. But a focus on sort of local government and the private sector alone isn't enough to explain the reduction of violence in Medellin. So in this particular case, powerful local drug trafficking organizations strategically chose to reduce lethal forms of violence in the city. And these groups did so in order to create a seemingly peaceful urban setting. So what did these organizations gain from this? Well, first, it significantly reduced political pressure on local government to go after organized crime in a concerted way. Second, while the homicide rate declined, other non-lethal and very lucrative forms of violent crime skyrocketed, including extortion and the local drug trade. So as local politicians in the private sector sold Medellin internationally as a progressive and innovative city, the most lucrative forms of criminal violence continued largely unchecked. And third, efforts to reshape public space in historically violent peripheral neighborhoods not only represented investment in those communities, but also opportunities for organized criminal groups to capture those investments. And this capture took multiple forms, ranging from charging taxes for community residents to use newly created public parks and plazas, to the infiltration of local civil society groups as a way to secure contracts from city government and foreign donors. These complex relations between the state, business, and criminal organizations are not unique to Medellin. Emerging research identifies similar dynamics in other cities and countries in Latin America, but also Africa and South Asia. So what this suggests, I think, are three emerging challenges that we might want to keep in mind as this agenda on cities, exclusion, and violence moves forward. First, there's this very important debate about data that we got a glimpse of during the last panel. But I think equally as important is that we take the time to unpack and understand whether the outcomes that we're measuring with our existing data, and that often serve as the objectives for development agencies and governments, actually represent what we think they mean. So when we focus on measuring the level or the spatial distribution of urban violence, we need to consider the many different and sometimes counterintuitive pathways and mechanisms that can lead to very similar outcomes. Because as cases like Medellin and others suggest, order within a city measured using relatively blunt metrics does not necessarily mean the absence of disorder within the city. The second emerging challenge I want to highlight is the role of the state in urban violence. And this connects to something that's come up a few times during the conference, this notion that the absence of the state enables urban violence, and the corollary hypothesis that if we could only bring the state into these spaces, then we could reduce violence. And there are certainly settings where that holds, but those hypotheses don't hold everywhere. The state is often deeply present in violent and conflictive urban environments. Sometimes the state is the protagonist when it engages in violence against civilians as part of trying to combat violent crime. We've seen this in places like Ciudad Juarez in Mexico and today in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And sometimes the state is the target of violence, as when armed criminal gangs target police officers for assassination, as was common in Colombian cities in the 80s and 90s, and is the case today in San Salvador in El Salvador. But other times, perhaps even most times, the state actually occupies a much more complex role than either outright protagonist or victim. It instead coordinates in complex ways with a range of non-state actors to use violence for different political, economic, and social ends. The state often establishes relationships with street gangs, militias, drug traffickers. And to what end? Well, there's lots of reasons: to win local elections, to displace marginalized populations from urban territories that have increased exchange value, and to exercise social control over particular populations. So what this suggests is that a second emerging challenge is that we have to consider that the state, the very actor we hope and expect should bring about positive change, can be complicit in urban violence. And this means that we need to think about the different ways and the different reasons for state complicity in urban violence. And the final point I want to raise has to do with the private sector more squarely. One of the things I noticed from yesterday's brief discussion was that we were talking about the private sector mainly as a source of capital, right? That if only we could figure out how to convince the private sector about the merits and financial benefits of generating security, then we could get it to invest in preventing or reducing urban violence. And I think this is an important role that the private sector can play. But also along the lines of what several people mentioned, I think we need to consider under what conditions is it that business can play a constructive or a not so constructive role in the dynamics of urban violence. Because business isn't only an economic actor, it's also a political actor. It can translate its economic resources into political power, and it can shape the distribution of power within cities. And so when we start to propose projects that challenge the political status quo as a way of empowering marginalized populations and reducing violence, I think we need to consider when and where business might be inclined to support or oppose changing the local political status quo. And thinking about that means that we need to stop thinking about the private sector as one large, homogeneous, coherent actor. The private sector has many different moving parts: sectors, sizes, types of firms, which means different relations to the state and different sets of interests vis-a-vis urban violence. But in addition to thinking about how business can be a partner to reduce violence, we also need to consider how business can foster urban violence. And business plays this role in many different ways. Research on urban displacement, some of which has been presented here, shows how the private sector can generate political and economic pressures that foster the displacement of marginalized populations in ways that reinforce structural violence. But business can also contribute to more direct forms of violence. So for example, I'm currently working on a project that examines how business firms within cities respond to extortion. And what I found is that different types of firms engage in very different types of responses. Some reach out to the state and work collaboratively to build state capacity in particular neighborhoods as a way to combat extortion. But in other instances, business firms organize, sponsor, and finance vigilante groups to carry out violence against alleged extortionists. And in other cases, firms build relations with the arms of the state, namely police officers, to engage in lethal forms of extrajudicial violence against alleged extortionists. And these are not multinational firms, which are another topic. These are small shops in retail and commercial sectors. These are places where people go to have dinner or buy a new pair of shoes that are also subsidizing various forms of violence in response to insecurity and criminality in cities. So as we move forward, I'm a strong believer that the private sector needs to be brought into the discussion, both analytically and practically, but that we need to do so in a way that accounts for the private sector as a complex actor that can both help but also worsen security conditions within cities.
Thank you very much. And I think that was very, very informative in helping us move forward in deconstructing what the private sector is about, something probably we've not done a lot of. It's, as you say, it's seen very much entirely in terms of its business capacity. Also very interesting links to the state that we will come back to. So this panel is really, I can begin to see the enormous connectivities between these different presentations. So I'm now going to pass on to my third participant, who is who is going to focus primarily on migration. And this is Mona Harib, from the Professor of Urban Studies and Political and Politics, and an Associate Dean at the Faculty of Engineering and Architecture at the American University of Beirut. And I really warmly welcome that we have some representation from that part of the world, because I think we're much more Latin America, Southern Africa, and other focuses. So welcome. Her research investigates local governance and refugees, urban social movements and youth in Lebanon. She has a PhD in political science and has a large number of publications. But I think the refugee experience is one which we've touched on here and there. We've touched on migration here and there, but is going to be such an unbelievably important issue that will add to the debate about safety and security. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's been a real pleasure being here. I echo what has been said earlier about the privilege of listening and being on the listening end of these fascinating 2 days. So I'm not really a scholar of migration, but I took up this role because I'm working on refugees, and this has been quite a useful exercise for me. And I come from a region where migration has been the name of the game for centuries, so I guess I will speak from that vantage point. So we know that migration is mainly about people who move voluntarily to seek better lives and livelihoods. This is the voluntary migration typology that is well documented in the literature, and that we know well as urban scholars and reflective practitioners, because it's a mobility that is good for cities. It enriches them on multiple levels, and this has been quite very well documented historically in various volumes. So mainly this involves people with skills, with social capital, sometimes with economic capital, who come and really add to the city's growth and development. And it's a category of migration, I would argue, that does not really need new tools to study or to document and even intervene on. There's a lot of work out there that we can refer to that can help us understand better how this migration contributes to rescaling of cities, their repositioning globally, and that encourages us to look at migrants and how they embed themselves in multiple transnational, social, cultural, economic fields and urban fields, and how this has been unfolding over several generations. So I will not talk much about this. I'm much more interested in talking about what has been labeled the refugee crisis that is unfolding in the Middle East, and Lebanon is one of the main countries taking up that refugee crisis. This is the kind of migration that is labeled as being involuntary, and that is referred to as being one of forced displacement. So this is generated by wars and also by natural disasters. So to echo back what my colleague was saying earlier, because of climate change, we are bound to see more and more this type of migration happening, and also because of rampant structural inequalities that the world suffers from, we also will see, or are seeing already, a lot of wars and conflicts happening, and it has been going on for decades now. It's not like it just happened over the past 2-3 years. I come from a country where every few years we have war, and this is like just ordinary for us. So I come back to that. So these displaced populations are labeled as refugees by organizations and the states. And they primarily seek shelter and work in cities. So they get housed in camps, depending on the situations. And sometimes they find housing and the jobs in the city's poorest areas, in its informal settlements, or in the poorest neighborhoods of the cities themselves. So migration is an urban phenomenon par excellence, as we say. It's mainly adding onto cities in the global south, and I want to emphasize that. We're not seeing cities in Europe or North America or Australia or Asia or Australia being flooded with refugees. Although all these NATO countries have fueled the wars that created these refugees, but they're not taking in any of these refugees. Relatively, the refugees are coming to Africa a lot. Nairobi is a case in point, and to the Middle East, currently with the Syria war that started in 2011. So we're talking about people with high vulnerabilities that lose everything. So just pause for a moment and imagine that you lose everything and that you have to start your life elsewhere with very little resources that you are able to take with you. So these are people who have also experienced the trauma of war crimes and who are coming in large quantities in these cities and that are seeking to access livelihoods, like basic livelihoods for them and their families. And they come to cities which are already struggling to provide their own dwellers with adequate infrastructure, social services, jobs, mobility, safety, and urban governance models. And despite all these challenges that these cities are currently suffering from, they take up this additional challenge of hosting and incorporating these refugees in their cities and neighborhoods. So in Lebanon, which is a very small country of 10,000 square meters, where 4 million people live, so the size of Nairobi, really, we are hosting 1 million refugees, even more. So you can see how many refugees this represents per capita. This is as much as Uganda. I was just researching how many refugees there is in Uganda because it has attracted so much attention after the book of Alexander Batts. So this is as much as the state of Uganda that receives all the support of UNHCR and others. So we have a majority of Syrians who live in cities and residential buildings. 71% are housed in cities and residential buildings. This is apartments, micro apartments, meaning the little room at the basement of a building, or they share rooms within other people. And they live in the poorest localities and neighborhoods of the cities and towns of Lebanon. 17% live in camps, which we don't call camps because we have Palestinian anxiety. I will discuss this if you're interested in it. So we call them informal tented settlements, ITSs, or gatherings. And there are about 5,000 of these small gatherings, so not more than 100 tents. And 12% live in non-residential structures, so garages, shops, construction sites, rooftops. Interestingly, there's no urban violence in Lebanon related to refugees. So no urban violence in the sense that you've been discussing over the past 2 days. No crime, no robbery, no rape. This is none of these indicators really increased with the Syrian crisis, refugee crisis. What increased is a lot of harassment, a lot of discrimination from Lebanese towards Syrians, not the other way around. So we have a lot of media that discriminates against Syrians, which become now the cause of every problem we have in Lebanon. So they're behind our problems related to garbage, electricity, water, as if before 2011 we never had problems of that sort. And of course, government officials use them as scapegoats in relation to that. And it's really the media is dominated by these discrimination and racist reports. And this leads to violence in the streets sometimes, to closing down of some Syrian shops in some neighborhoods. But I wouldn't label this as violence in the words in the framework that you've been using in this conference these 2 days. So as such, we have, as urban scholars and urban practitioners, a huge set of additional challenges to deal with and to address very quickly, to inform the authorities of what's the most effective way and sustainable way to deal with this major, what has been labeled a burden on cities. And in that sense, I think that we need a new paradigm shift, if I want to use this term, a new policy agenda to frame the question through which we pose the issue of refugees on the table. And in that sense, I think it's a very simple shift that has been already operated in scholarship and even in the UN Habitat corridors. But it's the problem of the implementation of that agenda shift that hasn't occurred. So I'm really talking about a policy agenda that is urban and that is developmental. And I think that my position here and what I'd like to defend here is that we need to do 4 things to advance and lobby for this agenda. First, we need to stop talking about a crisis as if this is something sudden that just happened. I think the person who spoke from the Rockefeller Foundation earlier said it very interestingly. Crisis is the new norm of cities today, so we better step up and deal with it. We will have refugees more and more in our cities. We will have more added pressure on our infrastructures and our daily urban challenges. So how do we address that? So debunking that crisis paradigm, that's the first point. And I come from a city that was invented to host refugees. Even before Lebanon was created, Beirut has hosted Maronites and Shiites and Druze and then Armenians and then Palestinians and then Iraqis and then Syrians. So Beirut has been a city of refuge forever. And if you look at the historical archive of each wave of migrants, you will find people who are catastrophed by the arrival of migrants and who accuse them of all the problems in the world and who say that Beirut will never be the same again and who will hold the same racist discourse that we hear today about Syrians. The second point I want to say is that the label of refugee is not useful. We're talking about refugees as if they're, like a singled out category. They're not a singled out category. They come in cities and live in informal settlements or camps that become informal settlements after a few years. And agencies deal with them as if they are different than other vulnerable populations. So in our work now, again, as part of an IDRC grant, we're trying to advance that premise of looking at dwellers and their quest for work and leisure rather than the needs of refugees as if they're different from the needs of any other dweller in the city. The third point is the need to ethnographically document and map and identify the ways through which refugees and other vulnerable dwellers in cities and towns are trying to access work, home and leisure and services, and to learn from their resilience and their resourcefulness and understand what we're calling the ingredients and the modalities that they're mobilizing in their quest for work, leisure and home. So once we understand how people are managing to access work and the home and services, we can enable this quest and we can make it happen much more effectively as urban practitioners alongside other actors. We can reduce the barriers that disable them from accessing the city and living a secure and decent life. So I'll end with that and encourage us all to try to find ways through which we can advance this agenda of an ethnographic documentation of these ingredients through which people access home and work and services, and to work with other local stakeholders towards the socially just city. And I think in this process, urbanists need to have a central role. In the opening of the keynote lecture of John Close yesterday, we understood the importance of urban plans, which seemed like a very commonsensical statement for someone like me who comes from urban planning, but I sense that this was not as natural for many others in the room. So I think that we need to spell it out very clearly. This is because we live in cities that are taking such a central role in the spatial production processes. We need to work with urbanists to understand these dynamics of spatial production and who can promote on the short term the need to access shelter and work for refugees and other vulnerable population, and the need to develop integrated urban development plans on the longer term to allow all the population, the vulnerable population and cities to access a decent, safe, inclusive and just city. Not only the high-heeled, we need to plan for them, we also need to plan for the lesser high-heeled who form the majority of cities today. Sorry for being a bit longer than I should have, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think that this provides us with a wonderful link, because we're talking about a city that is absorbing large numbers of people coming not only from climate reasons, but also from conflict. And my last speaker that I want to introduce is Ricardo Romero. Now, Ricardo is the mayor of Ipiales, which is a town in Colombia, which is, as we know, has just signed a peace pact, and Ipiales is on the border with Ecuador. So it's a city that is very near the border between Colombia and Ecuador. And I'm particularly honored to welcome him because he was part of the leadership of one of the guerrilla movements, the M19, the M19 as they're called, that were active guerrillas who came in, and it was part of a long-term peace process that has been going on in Colombia. And he then became a candidate for the Colombian Congress for that group, because what's been very interesting in Colombia is the integration of ex-combatants, ex-guerrillas into government positions themselves. He held the position of Secretary of Community Development and then councillor in Pasto in the Nariño region in southern Colombia. And he studied philosophy, worked as an editor and a journalist. And Ricardo will be speaking in Spanish, so please all put on your headsets if you are not agile in Spanish. And I'm particularly grateful because he has waited for 3 days and he's our last speaker. So thank you. Muy amable, Ricardo.
Gracias por invitarnos a conocer este proceso. Valoramos este esfuerzo, esta investigación, en el intento de hacer de las ciudades unos espacios de beneficio, de bien común y no de daño para la gente con acciones violentas o con indiferencia social. Efectivamente, vengo de Ipiales, del sur de Colombia, es en la frontera norte con el Ecuador, de un espacio seguramente como muchos otros que están en ese proceso de transformarse en ciudades intermedias con cerca de 200.000 habitantes, con una presión de la población rural buscando un espacio en las ciudades y de la ciudad intentando quitarle territorio al campo. Pero hoy quiero llamar la atención sobre una relación autoridad y delincuencia, cómo incide en la violencia y en la exclusión, y qué debemos hacer para no dejar derrotarnos. Cuando la delincuencia se toma el gobierno local, en esas ciudades lo único que queda bien organizado es el crimen, y lo que mejor funciona es la exclusión. La ilegalidad se convierte en la norma de comportamiento generalizada, y el abuso de poder, el uso del poder genera un ejemplo negativo que le quita toda posibilidad de convocar a la población hacia comportamientos de respeto y solidaridad. Se generaliza la corrupción, la complicidad con la actividad delictiva, no entendida como la corrupción policial, sino como el uso mafioso del gobierno, del poder, de la autoridad local. Y hay casos donde se presenta aún la participación directa en actividades delincuenciales. Esta situación realmente debe llamar la atención porque se oculta en la forma de ejercicio democrático del poder, pero en la práctica y en la realidad se construye una dictadura delincuencial que usa la extorsión, el chantaje, como una forma de control de la sociedad. Y la sociedad se degrada y los valores desaparecen y quedamos ante una situación de desgobierno para la construcción de la equidad y de abuso del poder para la creación de situaciones de violencia. La salida que nosotros planteamos es la de la construcción de ciudadanía. No vemos otra opción. Finalmente, quienes pasamos por el poder local, por el gobierno local, estamos en situaciones pasajeras, es algo temporal. Lo que realmente queda es la ciudadanía, es la gente, y allí está el reto. ¿Qué tanto somos capaces de construir ciudadanos, es decir, personas, sujetos de derechos y no objetos manipulables? En ese esfuerzo quiero hoy solo destacar 3 programas en los que estamos comprometidos. La construcción de planes de vida por barrios y veredas, por pequeños espacios territoriales, tanto de la parte urbana como del sector rural. Es un ejercicio de planeación colaborativa, donde pretendemos que la comunidad recupere su historia, recuerde su pasado, valore su propia gente, donde queremos recorrer el territorio para poder identificar cada una de las dificultades y donde buscamos caracterizar a la población. Todo esto para construir una agenda social conjunta entre autoridad local y comunidad para poder trabajar con planes a corto, mediano y largo plazo. El método que estamos trabajando es otro programa que quiero destacar. Lo hemos denominado la minga. La minga quiere decir en las poblaciones indígenas una práctica de juntarse aportando cada quien lo que puede para lograr entre todos un bien común. La minga es el pensamiento y la acción colectiva, es el aporte particular en beneficio general. Así las cosas se hacen más rápido y mejor. Ese es el método que nos hemos propuesto implementar, para finalmente lograr como resultado un juego limpio. ¿Cómo podemos volver a colocar lo público al servicio de lo social? ¿Cómo volvemos público lo público? Porque esta relación delincuencia-autoridad lo primero que hace es negar lo público como un bien común y obstaculizar, impedir el conocimiento por parte de la ciudadanía de lo que es de todos. En eso estamos. Por eso decimos que para evitar que nos gane la delincuencia, los espacios que estamos recuperando, toda acción y toda obra que se construya debe pensarse desde 3 poblaciones: desde el adulto mayor, con su experiencia y su perseverancia; desde la población en discapacidad, con su capacidad de superarse, de salir adelante; y desde la infancia, con su aporte de inocencia y de alegría. En eso estamos en el sur, y allá los invito, vayan cuando puedan, los recibimos cuando quieran. Un abrazo.
Thank you very much indeed.